China's rise from 1978 took place in a relatively stable international environment. And at the core of this was the relatively benign relationship between the United States and China. There were two fundamental assumptions that underpinned America's attitude towards China over this period. The first was that China was so far behind economically that it was virtually impossible to imagine China becoming an economic challenger or threat to American economic ascendancy in the world. And the second factor, and I think more important factor, was that the American belief was that as China modernized, it would westernize. Because remember, the American attitude fundamentally was that the process of modernization was also a process of westernization. So the American assumption was that over time, China would become increasingly look like a Western country, look like the United States, have, for example, centrally, a Western-style political system. And so this was the other aspect. And the Americans took it for granted that if this didn't happen, then China's rise would come to an end, hit a wall, be unsustainable. Now, what began to undermine these two American assumptions about China really starts with the financial crisis, Western financial crisis, in 2008. This was the beginning of the turning point. Now, this was completely unexpected. America had not experienced a financial crisis like this since 1931. And America was in big trouble. The West was in big trouble during this period. And to be frank, it's never really recovered. Its growth rates have been, until the pandemic, which is a different story, have been very low. Interest rates have been extremely low. To some extent, the Western economy has been on a life support system. Meanwhile, China has been in a completely different situation during this period. I mean, China was of course affected by it, but basically China continued to grow at more or less the same rate as it had before. And by 2014, extraordinary, China overtook the United States in terms of GDP primary purchasing power, according to this measure from the World Bank. China by this time also, on an annual basis, was contributing something like 1/3, was accounting for 1/3 of global economic growth. So you see, there's a chasm in the experience, on the one hand of the West and the United States in particular, where it all started, and on the other hand, China. But there was something else we must add to this picture. And that was, remember, politics. The economic crisis was expected by the West to happen in China. It happened in the West. The political crisis was expected by the West to happen in China. It happened in the West. Because what happened was that there was growing discontent, unease, dissent, anxiety, anger in the West about the impact of the financial crisis on people's living standards and so on. And you got the rise of growing dissatisfaction, particularly amongst traditional working class people and so on in the States and elsewhere, and the rise of what we came to know as populism. So this was a really important moment which began to undermine the situation in the West, both economically and politically. And with the consequence that there was also, because of the contrasting experience on the one hand of the West, on the other hand China, a growing anxiety in the West, and particularly in governing circles, but not only in governing circles, about the challenge of China China, our partner, as it were, since 1972, was seen increasingly as a threat. There was growing anxiety, there was growing hostility towards China as a result of this. And so eventually, of course, this culminates in the election of Trump in 2016 as American president. But this was not just a matter of the Republicans. This new attitude of hostility towards China was pretty bipartisan. Now, why couldn't America tolerate the rise of China? Why does it immediately translate China's rise into the China threat? And here we have to, I think, understand the psychology of an imperial power, and the United States in particular. You see, the Americans are extraordinary over a very long historical period, centuries, have always kind of been on the rise. And since 1945, they've been overwhelmingly the kind of global hegemon. The idea that America is number one is part of the American DNA. It's not just the presidents and the congressmen and so on who believe this. This is deeply imbued, I think, in the average American. The Americans think they're best. The Americans think they have to be top dogs. They're not going to be bossed around by anyone else. They're not going to be rivaled by anyone else. Now, of course, the reality is rather different, historically speaking, because no country can ever expect to be number one forever. Think of China, the century of humiliation. China was displaced. And so this was the case with Britain and so on. And this will be the case with the United States. America's relative economic decline probably starts around the 1980s. But the Americans have basically been in denial of this. Even to this day, they're largely in denial. It would be suicide for an American president to say, we are in decline and we cannot change that situation. We have to accommodate ourselves to a new world. Americans are not ready for this kind of argument. So, what was the American response to China as a threat? Essentially, the American response was an assault against China, to find a way of making China's rise more difficult, to prevent China's rise if possible, if not at least obstruct China's rise. And so, after Trump becomes president, you see after a short while the beginning of the trade war. And then after the trade war, or alongside the trade war, the tech war. And steadily, as the acrimonious and abrasive approach to China developed, you see action being taken against China on all sorts of different fronts. I would argue now, I think probably it would be appropriate to call the situation that the world is now in and the relationship between the United States and China as a new Cold War. But just because we use the term Cold War doesn't mean we should confuse or conflate this Cold War with the one between the United States and the Soviet Union. There are three fundamental differences between them. The first is that the United States and the Soviet Union lived and occupied two entirely different economic worlds. Never the twain shall meet. They just had two different international systems, one belonging to the United States, the other to the Soviet Union. Now, of course, this is not the situation with China. China is hugely integrated with the global economy. Indeed, I would argue that in some respects it's more integrated with the global economy than is true of the United States. I mean, take for one thing trade. I mean, China is a much more important trading nation, exporting and importing, than the United States. Now, whatever the Americans say, whatever the Trump administration would like to do, they will not be able to excise China from the global economy. They can go about it, but they won't get that far, in my view. They can't take, as it were, take China out of the global economy. It is simply too important. It is too integrated. Its relations with so many countries around the world are too advanced for that to happen. My second point is the Soviet Union was never an economic peer or equal of the United States. At most, it had maybe accounted for maybe 60% the size of the American economy. Probably less, probably more like half. Now, you cannot say that of China. China already in 2014, as we've seen, had overtaken the size of the American economy measured by primary purchasing power, GDP. Now, it is generally expected that within the next few years, maybe 5 years, depends partly on the impact of the pandemic, that China will overtake the United States by the other measure of GDP, which is in dollar terms. And if we extend the time horizon a bit further, you'll see the picture of the global economy by roughly 2030. Now, all these figures are obviously projections, so they're obviously, they're not facts. But you'll see, it gives you some idea that by 2030, China could account, this is by PPP, GDP, PPP, could account for 1/3 of global GDP. By which time it will be something like twice the size of the American economy. Already by this measure, by the way, it is 20% bigger than the American economy. And you'll see also that even when you combine the American economy and the EU, China will be larger than both put together. So, the rise of China economically is formidable. And it is deeply embedded, and it is showing its ability to perform in many different areas, including, of course, technology. The third point I would make is that the Soviet Union made a fundamental mistake in its relationship with the United States, and that was the arms race. It tried to compete militarily with the United States, and it's spent so much money, wasted such resources in a disastrous approach. China won't make that mistake. China won't make that mistake for two reasons. One, China doesn't emphasize the military in a way that, for example, the United States does or the Soviet Union did. And so China's approach is much more the fundamental importance of the economic. I think the prospect is that we are looking at this kind of situation we've got now, the Cold War and antagonistic relationship between the United States and China for the foreseeable future. And it's impossible to predict how long. But you can say, or I would argue, that the condition for a change in this antagonism depends on a shift in the American position. You see, the Americans are insisting that they should enjoy sole primacy in the world. And this is no longer possible. This atmosphere and relationship will change is the moment when the United States comes to the view that it must share primacy in the world with China. And that will be the precondition for, I think, a new turn in the relationship between the United States and China. Many voices in American leadership have attacked China on a number of different, all sorts of questions, all sorts of issues. And I will just talk about three here. The first is the argument that's come from the Trump administration that China's only got to where it is by cheating, by copying, by bullying American companies and other Western companies technology transfer and so on. Look, there is not a single country in the world that has ever gone up the economic chain by not borrowing from other countries. I mean, what did America do when it started to try and industrialize? It borrowed very heavily, i.e. copied, i.e. stole, if you like, from German companies. And so what China's done is absolutely no different, in my view, from what essentially has been the story of innovation worldwide throughout the industrial era. So what China's doing is not different from what it's been doing essentially since 1978. The difference is this, that China is now far stronger, far more advanced than it was previously. And the American criticism of China are not because they're doing something different, it's because they've travelled a long way and are now a very serious competitor for the United States. Now, of course, we see the trade war, the tech war. Let me just say something briefly about the trade war and the tech war. Fundamentally, the trade war is not going to work. I mean, it's going to damage China, but it's probably going to damage the United States more than it damages China. It's damaged the rest of the world as well, by the way. But essentially, I think probably the biggest sufferer of the two will be the United States. Or take the tech war. Actually, this is going to fail. Again, it's causing damage to China. It's caused damage to Huawei, particularly on the issue of chips. But it's not going to succeed because China's innovative energy, innovative potential, innovative dynamic is just too strong now. And quite frankly, I expect over the next 10 years to see China becoming the technological leader in many, many new areas compared with the United States. Now, this brings me to my second point, and I think one of the most depressing, in fact, one of the most disgraceful episodes in Western attitudes towards China was to do with the pandemic, COVID-19. I mean, in January, China was struggling to understand what the pandemic was, to identify it, and to work out how to deal with it. And the West, particularly the Americans, but not only the Americans, my own country, Britain, for sure, relentlessly attacked China. You know, cover up, secrecy, you're not telling us the truth, you're covering up, the survival of the government the party matters more than the survival of people. And so these were the kind of arguments that were dredged up. This was in a situation where China was struggling in great difficulty. Remember, China was the first to tackle the question of COVID-19. Now, and you can see that actually China's performance on COVID-19, certainly from late January, was brilliant. I mean, these figures here are on the basis of per capita, the number of deaths per capita. Look at China, probably the strongest performance of any country in the world, even though it had to tackle COVID-19 before anyone else. And all those great critics, the United States and other Western countries, my own United Kingdom and so on, who could not stop themselves attacking China, showed no compassion in January, have had those 2 extra months to deal with it, could have learned from China, and look at them, a miserable performance. And I would say this, in addition, that the pandemic has been, perhaps above all, a test of governance. And without question, China has come through this fundamentally with flying colours. And the United States has been proven under the Trump leadership, but I think unfortunately more generally, to have been incompetent. And the fact that China's now coming out of the pandemic, of course, has created major economic opportunities. There's only one country of this list here that is going to have positive growth in terms of GDP in 2020, and that is China. Everyone else, look at that, minus 8% these are IMF projections, 8% decline for the United States, 10% for the UK, and so on. My last point is this. It's about the criticism of China, that it doesn't observe the rule of law, that it doesn't observe the norms of the international system, and so on. This has been, you find this kind of criticism very frequently. And I think we need to be clear about certain things here. First point, China had no say in the present rules and norms of the international system. They were all developed by the United States and Western Europe. So China was not a party to the international system. Nevertheless, China has since, with its growth and its rise, has been a very good global citizen in the UN, in the WTO, in the IMF, in the World Bank. China has played a very positive role, and China has always been very generous in its praise for the international system and the way it has been a beneficiary of that system. Let me just say something else as well here. You know, since China's rise started in 1978, China has not really been involved in any wars whatsoever. This is the period of China's great rise, great transformation from nothing to now being equal with the most powerful country in the world economically. Now look at American history, or German history, or British history, or Japanese history. All of these countries were involved in many wars during the equivalent period of their historical development. China, in other words, has exercised extraordinary restraint during this period of its development. Now, I would say this, and that is, I don't believe the present international system can survive for a long time. And the reason is quite simply this. We live in a completely different world, a rapidly changing world. In 1980, the centre of the global economy was here. And then slowly, in the subsequent 30-odd years, it shifted. You can see it shifting here. And today, it's somewhere about here. That's the centre of the global economy. In those days, the global economy was essentially Western Europe and the United States. By 2050, it'll be here, basically on the Indian-China border. There's no way you can have an international system which is controlled by, essentially, and privileges the United States and Western Europe when actually the centre of the action is over here. You need a different kind of global economy, a different kind of global order for that kind of situation. And I would say this in relationship to this new international system. First of all, at the heart of it will be China, 18% of the world's population. At the heart of the present international system is the United States, just 4.3% of the world's population. Secondly, this increasingly, what we're witnessing is the rise of the developing world and the decline of the developed world. Today, it's something like this. 39% of the global economy is accounted for by the developed world. 61% is accounted for by the developing world. By 2030, it'll be something like this. This will be the Western world plus Japan, and this will be the developing world. In the developing world, 85%, something like 85% of the world's population live. In this part of the world, less than 15%. In other words, we're talking about an international system which will be far more representative of humanity than it is now. In other words, we're moving from an essentially authoritarian, minoritarian system of global governments to something which is far more representative of the world as it is already, and as it will be even more so in the future. So I see China's role as essentially very positive in terms of the future. I think there's something else that needs to be said here, and that is that the rise of China, not just China, the rise of the developing world as well, of which China, of course, is part, is creating a big crisis in the West. I would call it the existential crisis of the West. Because for 200 years, the West has run the world, has assumed that the world is its world, has been at the heart of all the major institutions which it has designed. The assumption that its people will run the world, that its language, now English, will dominate, that the people who run the world by and large will be white. This era is coming to an end. This era is no longer sustainable. It's not just the rise of China, it's the rise of the developing world as well. And you're experiencing in the West now a backlash against this process. And this change is not just happening in the United States, it's a global change. It's the rise of different peoples, different colours, different languages, different cultures, different civilizations. I like the Chinese expression, inclusive civilization, but the West has got no idea how to embrace that. So this is a very important aspect of what we're talking about. And I'll just finish by saying this. Look, I regard China's rise to be extraordinarily positive. That doesn't mean that China doesn't make mistakes, hasn't made mistakes, won't make mistakes in the future. Of course it will. It's on a learning curve. It's only just really beginning to be a great power. But China is a very good learner. We can all see that. Thank you.